today we're going to be talking about how to set up essentially a Hello World application that uses Azure DevOps, Azure Cloud Services, and Visual Studio to create, deploy, and do CI/CD on an application using all of the Azure tools. This is the way that we did it with EFCX. So let's see what we can do. So the first thing we're going to do is we need to create a empty repo that we can use for our Git, our source control. So we're going to go to writeuta.visualstudio.com. That is the Azure DevOps portal that we use for UTA. You can see that we already have a couple of projects in here. So we're going to create a new project, and we'll just call this project Y, since it was similar to Project X. And we're going to call it a Hello World project for Azure and Azure DevOps. Okay. We're going to make it private. Most of the things that we're going to do within UTA obviously will be private. Anything made public are available on the internet, and we don't necessarily want that to be the case. So we're going to create this project. Okay, so now we have our project. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to come in here and we're going to want to have a repo. Now, when you create a project, it automatically creates an empty repo for you. And so we're going to clone this empty repo into Visual Studio, and then we can use it to put all of our code in. So by default, it's wanting us to clone it in VS Code. I'm not using VS Code. I'm using Visual Studio. So we're going to drop this down, and we're going to say we want to clone this in Visual Studio. So if you select that, then it's actually going to let you open up Visual Studio and automatically clone it down for you. So we're going to pick that, and you can see that it pops up Visual Studio 2017, and it will take us to the correct dialogues to allow us to clone that empty repo down to our machine. So we're just going to go ahead and put it right in here. C users, Troy, documents, development, project Y. And so when we hit clone, it's going to create that repo on our local machine and tie it to the repo up in Azure DevOps. We need to create a solution inside of that repo so that we can use the repo's capabilities and source control. So what we're going to do, if you click on here, solutions and folders, to see a view of solutions, well, there's no solutions in here, right? It's a completely empty repo. So what we need to do is we're going to go to Team Explorer, and then right here it says the repository cloned successfully, and it gives us an opportunity to create a new project or solution in this repository. So this is what we want to do so that we can have our solution put into our repository and properly track the remote thing. So we're going to click on that, and then we're going to create a new ASP.NET Core Web application. We're going to call this project Y Web. Okay, and you see it sets the location to the place that we cloned the repo, because it already knows about that. So we're going to hit OK on this, and it's just going to create a standard ASP.NET Core Web application for us. So we have a lot of options here, and I'm not going to belabor the point too much, but we're going to do a web application with Model View Controller. There's a lot of different options here. We could do an Angular, we can do a React with Redux, just an API, and we can also have Docker support if we want, and we can change the authentication mode if we want. We're not going to do Docker support right now because that's out of scope of this discussion, but we are going to configure for HTTPS because, as everybody knows, every website and API should now be HTTPS enabled. So we're going to go ahead and click OK to create that. And so now we have our ASP.NET Core Web application. So if we go and run this, we should be able to see that we have just the basic ASP.NET Core Web app. Now this might look a little different than what you're used to because this is using the .NET Core 2.2 templates, which are actually quite a bit more empty than the 2.1 template was. So this looks a little bit different. But this is, you can see, this is our web application. So we'll close that. Now the next thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to go in and we're going to want to commit these changes into the repository. So the changes are that we just added a bunch of files, and so we want to commit changes into the repository. So if we go click on changes, then we can commit that. And you can see all the files that are added. These are all the brand new files that were created as part of this template. Now one thing to be aware of with when you're committing files into the repo is that you'll notice that the commit all button is grayed out right now. That's because you have to put in a comment for every time you commit. So you could put a space and commit, and that will let you do that. I wouldn't recommend doing that because that kind of defeats the whole purpose of commenting your commits. So what you're going to want to do here is you're going to want to put a good message as to what this commit includes. The reason for that is because as we go through the Azure DevOps CI/CD pipeline, any comments that are put into your commits get tied to the builds and releases that are used to go up into Azure DevOps. And the hope is that if the comments and the work item links are good enough, that can be used as documentation for things like TCCB and change control. And so the better comments you put in here, the less chance there is that you're going to have to do a lot of documentation later when you want to get changes approved. At least that's the hope. So we're going to put in a comment, initial commit for the new project. Okay, and then you'll notice that the commit all button has a little arrow next to it. So if you drop that down, you have three different options for committing to a repo. You have the commit all in push, and commit all in sync. The commit all will commit all of your changes down to the local repo on your machine. So it won't actually push anything up to the server. This is kind of handy if you're at the end of your day and you have some stuff that you're not done with, it maybe isn't working fully yet, but you want to have the ability to put that into the repo so that you can have change tracking, you can have reversion capabilities. You know, it gives you all of the capabilities that the source control provides without actually pushing it up to the server for other people to get. You don't want other people to get broken code. You only want to push things up to the server when you have it working, because you don't want to break the build, because then you get in trouble and nobody likes that. So commit all will commit it locally only. Commit all and push will take what you have, commit it to your local repo, and then push it up to the server. Commit all in sync will take what you have, commit it to the local repo, and not only push your stuff up to the server, but also grab everything from the server that you don't have. So it'll make you in sync with what's in the server. You need to be careful a little bit with commit all and push, because it could fail. If there's stuff on the server in files that you changed that you don't have, then it won't let you do a push. You're going to have to do a sync so that you get the stuff down from the server first, and then it'll push the stuff up to the server. So we're just going to do a commit all and sync. Okay, so you can see now that we have successfully pushed the branch master to origin. So we pushed it up there, and it's in the server. So if we go back into the browser and we go look at our repo and we hit refresh, it shouldn't say that it's empty anymore. It should now have our files. So this is all of our files that we just uploaded to it. And you can drill down in here and see that this is all the stuff that we have. Okay. Okay, so now we have a ASP.NET Core Web application that is tied into Git in Azure DevOps, and it is keeping track of stuff for us. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to make this available for our users. Okay, so let's pretend that all our users care about is an empty ASP.NET Core application, and that's what the requirements were. Well, we can make that easy for them. So there's a couple of ways we can do that. We can obviously put it into IIS just like we can with every other application, but this discussion is going to talk about how to put that into Azure. So there's a couple of ways to put things into Azure. The easiest and quickest way is to do what we call a right-click publish. And everybody's done that 100 times. You just right-click on your project and you say publish. And so what that's going to do is that is going to allow us to publish this up into Azure. And we can do it one of two ways. We can either have it create a new app service for us, or we can select an existing app service. Well, we don't actually have an app service set up yet, and so we're going to do a create new. So if I hit publish, then it is going to have us pick which Azure subscription we want. I am not going to pick the UTA Hybrid Azure. This is the UTA's government Azure. As a developer at UTA, you should have your own MSDN account that gives you access to an Azure portal. And so we're going to use that one right now. And the reason for that is that in order to use the government portal, you have to do a couple of different things, and we can discuss that later. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to give this an app name. So we're going to call this Project Y Web. Now, one thing to be aware of here is that this name actually needs to be unique throughout Azure. So if there's some other company using Azure somewhere that have already picked that name, Project Y Web, then we can't use it. Obviously, you can see that it didn't give us an error, so Project Y Web is available. And oddly enough, I very rarely run into cases where a name isn't available. So then we need to pick our subscription. We only have one subscription in this account, and so we'll choose Visual Studio Professional. Then we need to create a resource group. Now, resource groups in Azure are simply ways to aggregate different resources and manage them as units. So it's possible in Azure, and we can look at the Project X portal later in the video, to get a lot of resources. So you'll have a lot of app services, you'll have databases, you'll have app service plans. There's a lot of resources, and as you get more and more resources, it gets harder to manage. So resource groups allow you to think of it as putting files into folders. You wouldn't put every file on your hard drive at the root because it's just too unwieldy. So you create folders and put files in folders to help manage them. The same thing is with resource groups. So we'll create resource groups to help us manage this. Now we want to create a new resource group. We're going to call this Project Y Resources, just for fun. Okay. And then the next thing that we need to do is we need to set up a hosting plan. And a hosting plan is how you determine how many resources are going to be allocated to your app services. And also the data center that they're going to be hosted on. So we're doing these things serverless, which means that we don't care about the server. We don't have to deal with a lot of the server stuff. But the reality is that there are servers underneath all of this, and they have to exist somewhere. And so we can specify in our apps, in our hosting plan, where we want this to reside. And the reason that this is important is because depending on where you host this stuff will determine a couple of things. It'll determine what capabilities are available in Azure. Not all centers, not all data centers have all of the same capabilities. And you want the actual physical servers to be as close to your customers as possible. So for UTA, we probably don't want to use the German data center to host all of our stuff, because then everybody at UTA is going to have to go all the way across the world to get their data. That doesn't make sense. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to pick one that's closer to Utah, because the laws of physics still apply even with cloud. So this one is set up for central US, which is fine. That's good enough for what we need. We can also set up application insights. I'm not going to do that right now, but we can look at that later. So, all right, so what this is going to do is this is going to go into Azure, and it's going to create all of these resources for us. Right now, these resources don't exist in Azure. So this is going to create the resources for us. And what this means is that we don't even need to go into the Azure portal in order to work with Azure and to deploy to Azure and to do all the stuff in Azure. We will go into the portal a little later on, but this is just a good way to get started. So we're just going to hit create here. And it does take a little bit of time to do this. So through the magic of editing, it should be done much quicker. Okay, so now it's doing a build. So it created the resources, and now it's going to build the project and release it up to those resources. Okay, so now you can see that it's installing the stuff that it needs to install up in Azure. And it looks like it's done. Okay, so now if we want to go in and make sure that it actually worked, you can see that we have this site URL here. So this URL, projectyweb.azurewebsites.net, that's the public facing URL for the website that we just put up there. So if we click on that, hopefully it will come up. And there you go. So there's our web application running in Azure, and we haven't even touched the Azure portal yet. So that's kind of cool. Now let's really quickly dive a little bit into the Azure portal and show how that works. We're going to bring up a web application, and we're going to go to portal.azure.com. So there's two different ways to get into Azure. Well, there's more, but we care about two different ways. The portal.azure.com will take us into the commercial Azure, and that allows us to play with the stuff that we have, our MSDN accounts. That's where our MSDN accounts live. Portal.azure.us is the government Azure portal, and that's where all of the live stuff is going to be. So when we put applications and websites into production for UTA, they're going to go into portal.azure.us. But when we're playing around, we need to do it in portal.azure.com. So we're going to go to portal.azure.com, since that's where we did everything. And this will come up with this dashboard here. This is our home screen. And interestingly enough, this is new. This is about a week old. Before about a week ago, it just went straight to your dashboard. So when I brought this up the other day, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. But that's one thing you'll notice, is that Azure changes all the time. They're constantly adding new features. They're constantly adding new stuff. And so one day you think you know everything in Azure, and the next day you don't know anything anymore. But we have our Azure services here, and this just kind of lets us go in and look and see what services we have. Right here is the most common services, and so if we want to see what SQL databases we have, we click here. If we want to see what function apps we have, we click here. All we have right now that we care about is app services. But what I want to do is I want to look at resource groups. So if we click on resource groups, you can see that there's a whole bunch of resource groups in here. And this is because I've been messing with this for a long time, and I've got a lot of stuff in here. Hopefully, we'll be able to find a project-wide resources, which is right here. So this is the one that Visual Studio created for us and deployed our app. So if we click on project-wide resources, it'll show all of the different resources that we have in that resource group. We have our project-wide web, which is an app service, and we have our project-wide web blah 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 plan, which is our app service plan. So these are the two resources that were created when we published our web app. So if we go into the project-wide web app service, there's a lot of things that we can see here that it did for us. So we have our URL, we have our app service plan. Right now we're at standard 1 small. So that 1 indicates how many instances are running, because we have the ability to do auto scaling in Azure, and right now we have 1 instance. And small, so we have a low-end plan, which is really what you want, because then it saves money. And there's a lot of things over here on the left side that we won't get into. We will talk about scaling up and out later. Right now I'm going to scale this back a little bit. By default, it put us into an S1, which is about $45 a month. And we get about $50 a month in Azure credits, and I don't want to gobble all of that up with that. So right now I'm gonna put it into the free tier just for our testing purposes right now, and we can go over some of those later. So I'm gonna put it into a free tier just to save my Azure credits. So as you're working in Azure, you need to be very careful with how you allocate resources. It's really, really easy to accidentally get a lot of money spent in Azure. You can go to the point where in SQL Server you're spending $15,000, $20,000 a month in SQL expenses. And typically managers don't like it when you do that, so it's probably best to be careful and try not to do that as much as possible. All right, so we switch this down, so now it's in a free tier. So let's say we don't want to have Visual Studio create our resources for us. We want to create our own, okay? So what we can do is we can go into our resource group and we can just do add. So we're going to click add here, and we're going to pick a web app. And you can see that there's a ton of stuff we can do. I mean, these are all the different things, and these aren't even all of them. These are just a sampling of things that we can create in Azure. We're going to create a web app, and we're going to create it as an API, actually, which works exactly the same way as a website. So we're going to call this Project Y API, if I can spell. And again, you'll see we got our little check mark there. That means that that name is not yet taken on Azure. Same thing, you pick your subscription, you pick your resource group, you can create a new one or use an existing one. We're going to go ahead and use an existing one since we have a Project Y resources. You can also select your OS if you want Windows and Linux. Now if you're using .NET Core, you can do either Windows or Linux, it doesn't matter. If you're planning on deploying an ASP.NET framework application, a full framework application, you can do Linux, but it won't work. And so it's probably best to pick Windows for something like that. And then you can either do a code or you can do a Docker image. So you can deploy Docker images to app services, and that works really well. If you're going to be doing a lot of Docker, it would probably be better to look at AKS, which is the Azure Kubernetes services, and do it through there. This is a really simple way to get into Docker, but it's not as flexible as the full AKS is. And then we have our app service plan, and we have application insights disabled for now. Now, the reason that I'm leaving application insights disabled is because the Azure government portal does not yet support application insights. And so if you get used to using application insights and all the great, awesome stuff that it provides, then when you get into the government portal and go into production, you're going to be severely disappointed. So I'm leaving that disabled for now just because it's not available in the government Azure yet. So we're going to hit create, and we're going to wait again. So it validated everything we put in, so everything is good. Now, if you look up here with this little bell, that's your alerts icon, and that little line scrolling underneath it indicates that it's working on something. So if we open that up, you can see that it's working on deploying that new app service that we created. And so it's not available for us yet, so we'll sit here and kind of wait for it for a minute.
Is this is something you would publish your code to?
Yes.
There's nothing there, but it's...
That's exactly right. So this is creating an empty an empty app service. So if we go to the resource now, we can see this is our Project Y API app service. So if we wanted to deploy something into that, then we could easily do that from within Visual Studio as well. So we're going to come into our solution here, and we're going to add a new project. And we're going to create a ASP.NET Core web application, and we're going to call this Project Y API. Okay, and we're going to hit OK. And here we're going to pick API now instead of the web application. We're going to hit OK. So now we have our Project Y API. We can do the same thing that we did with the web. We're going to go ahead and we're going to publish this, but we're going to select existing this time because we already created an app service that we want to put this in. So if we hit publish, the screen obviously is a little bit different because we're not having to provide all the information. So we're going to, it already picked our account, our subscription, our view. Now we're going to come in here. You can see we have this Project Y API. We could publish it to Project Y Web, but then it'll override everything that's already in there, and we don't want to do that. So we're going to publish the Project Y API, and we're going to hit OK. And then it's going to go through the regular publish process, just like you would even with IIS. And once this is done, we're going to have our API up in Azure. And there you go. So we're done. We have the install, the publish succeeded, and we have our API now up in Azure. So we can use that. So you can see that you can do it both ways. You can create new resources and have Visual Studio take care of all of that, or you can go create resources and then do it that way. And you're going to want to do that when we get into deployment slots, because at this point, there's no way to create an app service and deployment slots and then deploy to the deployment slot from within Visual Studio itself. And so we'll discuss that down the road a little bit. So that's where we are. So we just created a Git repo, we committed to the Git repo, and we published to Azure from within Visual Studio. So let's go in here really quickly. We're going to go to Team Explorer. We're going to go into our changes. You'll notice we have a lot of changes again. The reason we have a lot of changes is because we added a whole new project, right? So we're going to give our comment, added an API project, and we're going to commit all and sync, which will push that up to our repo for us. And again, if we go back and look at our repo, which is right here, and we hit refresh, now we should have 2 projects in here instead of just the one. So we have our Project Y API and our Project Y Web. Okay. So just because we can right-click Publish outside of Visual Studio doesn't necessarily mean that we should. And the reason I say that is because when you right-click Publish out of Visual Studio, there's very little traceability as to who published, what was published, when it was published, and all of that kind of stuff that we really need to know for TCCB, and not even just TCCB, but it's just being a good steward in the deployment realm. So what we really want to do is we want to use the DevOps capabilities in Azure DevOps to do all of our publishing and all of our building for us. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go into Azure DevOps and we're going to create a build pipeline. So there's 2 different types of pipelines that you use in Azure DevOps. There's your build pipelines, which take your project and does just that. It builds the project. And you can do a lot of other stuff in there as part of the pipeline, but at a basic level, it builds your project, makes sure that everything works properly and that everything is going to compile. And so we're going to build a build pipeline first. So if we go into Azure DevOps, you can see we're still in our repo. If we go down here to pipelines, you can see that we have several different things. We're going to concentrate at this point on build pipelines. We don't have any build pipelines right now, so we need to create a new one. So we're going to create a new pipeline. Now, the first thing that you need to do when you create a pipeline is you need to tell Azure DevOps where it's going to get the code that needs to be built, right? There's a lot of places you can get the code from in Azure DevOps. So Azure DevOps kind of has the mantra of any code, anywhere, anytime, any language, blah, 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 whatever. And they really do support a whole bunch of stuff. Since we have all of our repos in Azure repos, it makes it a little bit easier. So we're just going to pick Azure repos. Here's our team project, Project Y. Here's our repository, Project Y. And here's the branch that we want to use for this build. Right now we only have one branch because we haven't done any branching yet. So we're just going to pick master as our branch. So we hit continue. And then there's all kinds of different templates that we can use to do this. So you'll scroll down and you'll see there's a whole bunch of stuff in here for different types of builds that you can do. Since we did an ASP.NET Core web application, we're going to pick ASP.NET Core. And what that does is that kind of puts in all the steps that you would typically need to do an actual .NET Core build. That includes doing a .NET Restore, a .NET Build, a .NET Test, and a .NET Publish. And those 4 steps will go through all the things. The .NET Restore will make sure all the NuGet packages are down to the right place. The .NET Build will actually go through and compile the application. .NET Test will run any of your unit tests and put the results out to a report. And then .NET Publish will take all that stuff and combine it into a file that can then be published up to your build server to be grabbed by a release pipeline later and put up to somewhere. So publish here doesn't actually mean that it's publishing it to your website. It just means that it's making those artifacts available. So there's a whole bunch of different things here. First we have our pipeline. Now we give this a name. We'll just say Project Y Build Pipeline because that's fun. Okay. And then we have to pick an agent pool. So there's different ways to do builds on Azure DevOps. We have this concept of agent pools. And you can see there's a whole bunch of different ways to do it. We have a hosted one, we have a hosted Linux, a hosted Mac. Okay, so if you need to deploy or build Mac stuff, you can do that here. Hosted Ubuntu. I like to use the hosted VS 2017 if I'm going to do a hosted one, because that has all of the stuff that Visual Studio 2017 would have, and it makes sure that it has all of the build tools and the SDKs that you're going to need. Since this is a Visual Studio app anyway, it makes sense to use the hosted VS 2017. We also have the concept of private agent pools, and the reason that we have those is because it allows you to set up a build server on your local network. So right here within UTA, and then the Azure DevOps will communicate with that local build server and do all of the work on the local build server and then send the results back up to Azure DevOps. That's valuable because there is a limited number of build minutes that you get with the hosted platforms, and so if you're doing a lot of builds, you can run into that ceiling pretty quickly. And once you run out of build minutes for the month, you can't do any builds anymore. Or you can buy more and spend some money. So by having it hosted on-prem, then you don't have to care about that. You can do use as many build minutes as you want, and it doesn't cost you anything extra. So we're going to just do this as the hosted VS 2017 right now, because we shouldn't have very many builds for this particular project. The next thing that you do is you need to pick what projects you want to restore. So we're going to just do all CSproj files in here. It's going to publish or build all of that stuff. And then we give it the name of our test projects, which is the tests folder and all the projects inside of there. Then we determine where we want to get our sources. We specified this before, but we can change that here. So we're going to get it from Azure repos, Project X or Project Y, master, and then there's some other things that we can do in here. So this is our agent job. So we can have multiple agent jobs to do things. We only have one in this one, and it will go and do all of our stuff. We can set up some parallelism if we want to, but you have to make sure that you have enough parallel jobs set up. And by default, you only get one parallel job with a hosted agent. And then you can see as we go into each of these commands, there's a lot of options for these too. So this is the restore. The command option here is the command that's going to be sent with the .NET runner, right? So whenever you do a .NET command line, you would do a .NET space restore, .NET space build. So this command here is the .NET command that you want to run for this step. So we're going to do a .NET restore here, and we're just going to do the default feeds. Then we're going to do a .NET build, then we're going to do a .NET test, and then we're going to do a .NET publish. So when you do a .NET publish, that will go through and make sure that all of your Angular stuff is right. So if you're using Angular 7, it will check your TypeScript, it will check your HTML to make sure that there's nothing mismatched. And if any of that fails, then it will fail the entire build. So let's go ahead and save this. Okay, so now we have a build. We can queue this up, and it will run the build on our code that we've already put in. So you can see here we have build 2019-0110.1 has been queued. So if we click on this link, it'll allow us to go in and we can see the whole process of that as it goes through the build. So it initialized job succeeded. Now it's doing the checkout. So it's going and getting all the code so that it can build it. And you can just watch it in real time as it goes through and does this whole thing. And we had a fail to restore. Okay, why did that happen? So you can click on, you can see, so what I did is you can click on the heading here, and it will open up a full log file of everything that happened. This will help you go in and find out where problems occurred. So chances are it's down at the bottom. Okay, so it turns out that there was a little bit of an issue with the .NET Framework 2.2, the .NET Core 2.2, and rather than trying to get it working right now, I decided I just went ahead and reverted back to .NET Core 2.1, and so now you can see that our our build succeeded now. So we can go in here and you can see each step that it went through and that it succeeded. Now in test we got a warning. So if you go look in that, it'll give you what the warning is. Project files matching the specified pattern were not found. What that means is that we don't have any test projects in our solution. So there's nothing for it to do, and it's just letting us know that. Typically, if you have test projects and they're in the test folder that our step defines, then it will run all of those tests. And if any of those tests fail, it will fail the entire build. Okay, so now let's go back and look at our build pipelines. And if we select this build pipeline here, you can see that we have a list of all the builds that it has run. So we've got the ones that were failed and then the one that finally succeeded. Now, if we go into our build pipeline, this is all great. We can run this by hand all day long if we want. There's this concept here of triggers. Triggers allow us to enable continuous integration. What continuous integration means is that every time a commit happens to the repo, this build will automatically get fired off. So if I turn that on, it gives us a couple other options. The first one, batch changes while a build is in process. You're probably going to want to turn that on because what will happen is if developer 1 checks something in and then developer 2 a minute later checks something in and then developer 3 a minute later checks something in, it's going to want to queue up 3 different builds. And you probably don't want to do that. You probably only want to queue up the first build and then wait until it's done and then queue up one more build. You don't want to just keep queuing builds all day long. You can also include different branches, and you can even put in path filters. So let's say you only want certain things to kick off a build. You can put path filters in there that then will allow you to more tightly control when builds are kicked off. So if you don't want to do continuous integration, that continuous integration can potentially get a little bit busy. If you're having people commit a lot throughout the day and it's constantly kicking off builds and that may be a little bit too much for what you need, instead of doing continuous integration, you could set up a schedule. So if you decide to set up a schedule, you can say, I only want to build at these times, and it'll automatically do a build at whatever time you specify. And so you can have it do it once a day, early in the morning, take everything that happened the day before, do a build, and process it that way. That is a little bit less obtrusive simply because it's not going to kick off 20 times a day. I mean, if you have a team that's checking in constantly, this build can be running constantly. And depending on how many build agents you have, if you only have one build agent, then that can really slow things down. We're going to keep it continuous integration turned on for now, and then we're going to go ahead and hit save.
And it saves your build minutes too if you decide to do it.
Absolutely. In fact, when we first set this up for Project X, we had it do a continuous integration on the hosted plan. We ran out of build minutes in a week. And so by having a local on-prem server and having a scheduled build, it really saves on that kind of stuff. So let's go back and look at our pipeline again. Now we've turned on continuous integration. Again, what that means is that anytime somebody does a commit, it's going to automatically kick off the build. So let's go see if that's actually true. So we're going to come in here and we're going to make just a simple change to our API. This is the startup class. Okay. Come over to our Team Explorer, go into changes, and we're going to say we made a comment in the code. Do what? You don't, and I'll show you why. So we don't have to save the file first because when we come in here and do commit all in sync, it asks us at that point if we want to save the file. And then we hit yes, it saves the file, it pulls down the stuff in the server if there is any, and it pushes it up. Now, assuming that everything was done correctly, when we come back here and hit refresh, we should see, we didn't even have to hit refresh, we should see another build kick off. So you can see that the commit that I just did initiated this build. And we can go in here just like we did with the other ones and we can watch the logs go through and make sure that the build succeeded. And this was an automatically launched build that we didn't have to do anything about. Now, if the build fails, you can have it send emails to whoever needs to get notified that a build failed. So it's really important that you try to make sure that you don't check in things that are going to break the build, because it's possible that everybody will know that developer 1 broke the build, and then people will start making fun of you, or at least they should, I think. Okay, so if we go back into our builds now and we look at that pipeline, you can see now that there's our build 5, and it is completed and it succeeded. Okay. Very cool. So now that's half of the CI/CD pipeline, right? That's the CI part. So CI means continuous integration. CD means continuous deployment. The CI part is done. We've continuously integrated with our build. So when we commit code, it automatically builds it for us. And that's fantastic, because now we can make sure that everybody's checking in quality code. The next part of CI/CD is the CD part, the continuous deployment. And we do that with what we call release pipelines. So we're going to go into our releases. And again, this is a brand new project, so we don't have any release pipelines. We're going to create a new release pipeline. Okay, so we're going to hit new pipeline. And it looks very similar to the way that we built up our build pipeline, with a little bit of extra stuff added onto it. So we want to deploy an Azure app service. Okay, so we're going to pick the Azure app service deployment template, and we hit apply. We're going to give it a stage, so we're going to actually publish to Azure. Okay. And then we come over here, so we'll close that. We come over here and you'll see that we have artifacts and stages. Artifacts are the build results that we want to deploy. So we're going to come in, we're going to add an artifact, and we're going to do a build. So this means that we're going to do the results of a build pipeline. So we pick our project, and then we need to pick our build pipeline. And this is the one that we already created, the project-wide build pipeline. So we're going to select that. Now, there's a couple of things that we can do here. We can specify a specific version that we want to deploy. We can have it deploy latest, or we can have it deploy different things with tags. There's all kinds of ways that you can specify which build results you want to deploy. We're just going to go ahead and pick latest for this. So what that means is that it's going to take whatever the very latest build was, and it's going to deploy it. Now, this is what you really want to do for staging environments and QA environments. Maybe you shouldn't ever really just deploy latest to prod without some kind of other checks in place. That's how you get in trouble and have a lot of extra new processes created. So we're going to do the latest, and we're going to call it that, and then we're just going to hit add. So that's our alias, or that's our artifact now. So the artifact is over here. The stages are over here. So once we grab the artifacts from that build, then we need to do something with them. And so that's what this stage is for, publish to Azure. So we're going to click on this link right here. Right now we have one job and one task associated with this stage. So we click on that, and you can see that we have some things that need attention. So the first thing we need to pick is our Azure subscription. So again, we only have one subscription that we're tied to here. We're going to pick that, and we need to authorize that subscription to be able to be accessed from Azure DevOps. This is a one-time thing that you need to do when you're tying Azure DevOps to a new subscription. Once you do this once, you don't have to do it again. So we'll go ahead and we'll click authorize. And it's going to have you log in with the credentials for your Azure portal. Okay. So we'll log in there. And don't look at the password. Everybody close your eyes, because I don't want you guys logging in with my stuff. And then we're going to have it stay signed in, blah, blah, blah. And then it's going to authorize Azure DevOps to be able to publish up to Azure. And again, this is a one-time thing. Once you've done it once, you don't have to do it again. Okay. So now you can see we have our Visual Studio Professional subscription enabled for this release pipeline. So then we need to pick our app service name, and we want to publish this up to Project Y Web, right? So then we're going to come down here to our agent. Again, you can pick the agent pool. We'll go ahead and keep the hosted one. We can also pick the local one. And you can pick all the other kind of stuff. We won't go through all that. And then we go to deploy Azure App Service. So this is going to deploy to Project Y Web. Okay, we're not going to deploy to slot just yet, but then we have to tell it what it is that we want it to deploy. So we've got 2 projects in this solution. We don't want to deploy both projects to the project Y web. So we're going to click on this, and this will allow us to go into the build artifacts into our drop folder, and you can see we have a project Y web.zip. So we're going to select that, and that's going to deploy our project Y web up to that app service. So there's a lot of other things that you can do in here. You can do file transforms. You can do JSON variable substitution. This is good if you want to change connection strings and stuff. You could do that in here. That's not really the ideal place to do those kinds of things. We can look at that later. You have additional deployment options. So you can take the app offline while it's deploying, publish using web deploy. There's a couple of different things you can do there. So taking the app offline, there's better ways around that by using deployment slots, and we'll talk about those later. So right now we have this deploy Azure app service. So that's what our release pipeline is going to be. So we're going to actually give this a name. We're going to call this Project Y Release Pipeline. Okay. So now this is going to release our application up to our app service, but it's not continuous deployment. So the way that it stands right now, this is a manually executed release. We want to enable continuous deployment. So the way that we do that is we click on this little lightning bolt here, and this will let us set up continuous deployment. So we just click enabled, and boom, we have continuous deployment enabled. You can also do it based on pull requests, but we're not dealing with pull requests right now, so we're just going to leave continuous deployment turned on. And then you see we have a little check mark next to this lightning bolt. That means that continuous deployment is turned on. So we'll hit save on this, and now we could do a release. In fact, let's go ahead and test it just to make sure it's going to work. So we do a create a release. It lets us do some things here, but we just want to do an automated release. It tells us what version it's going to release, 10.5. We can drop this down and select a different version. It'll let us select any successful build. We're just going to do 10.5, and then we hit create. Same way with the build. It shows us up here in a little note, the release 1 has been created. If we click on that and go look at it, you have the same kind of thing where you can go look at the logs, and here's the logs for our release. So now we can see that our release succeeded, and so everything went through fine. Let's do one other test, and I'm a little bit nervous about this, but we're going to try to go to our website again, Project Y Web, and see if it still works. And drum roll, it still works. Okay, beautiful. So we've got our build pipeline, we've got our release pipeline, we've got the pipeline all the way through. Now, how can we prove that they're actually doing anything, right? Well, what we can do is we're going to come into our web application, and we are going to go make a little change. So let's find a view, let's see, probably the home view, probably the index page. Let's see. So we have this word welcome, right? So we can see here it says welcome. Well, that is this HTML right here, the word welcome. So we're going to say welcome to the new world. Okay. Welcome to the new world. Now, the theory is that as we commit this, without us doing anything else other than doing a commit, we should see the website change the next time we refresh it and have our welcome to the new world. So, good Lord willing and the creek don't rise, once we do this, everything should just flow through like magic. So we're going to go into changes. We're going to say changed the welcome text, commit all and sync, and then stand back and watch the magic happen. So I'm not going to do anything, but I do want to show that things are getting kicked off. So we're going to go look at our builds, and we should see a build pipeline kickoff, which it did. So now it's build 6, and you can see that it's in progress. So if we go look at that, we just want to watch the log. So far so good. We kicked off a build based on a commit that we just did. Let's see if it works. Everybody cross your fingers. And it succeeded. So we should be able to go look at our release pipeline and see if it created a new release. And look at that. We have release 2 now. So if we go look at that, we should see it in progress. It's publishing to Azure. We can go look at the logs. Oh. Sometimes you'll notice that Azure DevOps doesn't refresh. For some reason, their signal R either doesn't work or something. So a lot of times, if it's just sitting there looking like it's not doing something, chances are it's already done and you just need to refresh. So we can see that the release pipeline did finish. Everything succeeded. So if we go back over to our website, and if we hit refresh, we should see, welcome to the new world. How freaking awesome is that? So what that does is that allows us to not worry about the deployments and the builds and all of that stuff. It lets us really concentrate on the development and building the product, and then everything else kind of takes care of itself. Now,
So I'm interested in seeing documentation on that change. How would you show that?
so yeah, let's say we want to see what changed, who changed it, when it was changed, and what was released. So we can go back to our release pipelines. Okay, so if we want to see what was affected by this release, what was actually done, what we would do is we would go back to our pipeline, and then you can see here that this is the build that was included in this release. So if we click on that, that will show us the build, and we can go into the look at the summary, and that'll show all of the things that were changed. So change the welcome text. So that was changed, and that's what was included here in this particular build. Okay, we could also go back to our release pipeline, and if we just click on the stage, then it will show us what happened for that stage. So again, associated changes, we have our project-wide pipeline. This is the build. We can go look at the commits, and that'll show all the different commits that happened, change the welcome text. We can also look at work items. So you have the ability to tie work items from Azure DevOps to a commit, and then you'll be able to see them in here. And we'll show how that works later as well. And then if anybody has any question as to, well, what was included in this release, what was pushed out, who did what, you can come into here and you can see that really easily. Because on the commits, you can even see the user that made that commit. And if you really want to, you can go look at the commit itself and look at the code that changed. So it's very rich in its logging capabilities and in its tracking capabilities. So if we use this the way that it's intended to be used, there will never be any question as to what was changed by who and when it was done. So typically, so what we've shown so far is we're publishing directly to prod. And as a general rule, that's not a good idea, right? You want to publish to at least one place before you take it up to prod. The way that we're going to do that is we're going to create a couple of different app services that reflect the different stages that we want this thing to go to. And just to make it easy, I'm going to go do it in the Azure portal itself. And so we're going to go into our resource group. And we're going to, so for this example, I'm only going to create one more. I'm going to create a QA app service, and then we'll use this app service as our prod. So we're going to create a new app service, and I'm going to call it Project Y Web -QA. Okay, now you saw before I put the -QA, the app name Project Y Web is not available. That means somebody else in Azure has already taken that name. And it turns out that it's us, but so by adding a -QA on it, that makes it unique again. And we're going to do the same thing we did before, use an existing resource group. We're going to use the Windows OS. We're going to publish code. Everything else is the same. So we're going to hit create. And again, all this does is this just creates a new app service that we call QA. Okay. So we'll let that go. Now while that's going,
Quick question: is this the point where if you wanted to have them running on different service plans, you could?
you would put this in a different service plan, exactly right. So what we've done in EFCX is that we put our staging services and our QA services on a different service plan. The reason being, especially for staging, you don't need the big beefy servers and resources that you do for prod. And you certainly don't need autoscale. And so we put our staging on a really low-end service plan. We put our QA on a slightly higher service plan. And then we put our prod on the high service plan that enables us to have the performance that we want to have in prod. Okay, so that's done. Now what we're going to do is we're going to change our release pipeline a little bit. So our build pipeline is not going to change, right? Our build pipeline has nothing to do with the app services in Azure. Our build pipeline simply takes stuff from Git and builds it and makes it available for the release pipeline. So we want to change our release pipeline. And what we want to do is we want the release pipeline to automatically release everything that we do directly to QA. Now, typically you might have one more in there. You might have a staging that you send it to. We're only going to do 2 for this demo. So we're going to have it go directly to QA. Now, once QA is approved and once everybody has looked at it and proved that it's good, then we can take it to production. And we typically want some constraints around who is allowed to send it to production and when it can go to production, things like that. And so we're going to show how to do that. So we're going to go in our same release pipeline. We're just going to edit the pipeline. Now, the first step, we don't want to take it to our prod for the first step. So the first step we're going to change to go to QA. So we're just going to come in here. We're going to say, okay, instead of going to project-wide web, we want to go to project-wide web-QA. Okay, and since these variables are it's what we call linked. These variables are linked to the rest of the steps. So when we come into our step down here, you can see that project-wide web-QA is already selected. And that's really the only change we need to make to this particular thing. So I'm going to change the name of our stage to QA. So publish to QA. So then when we come back and look at our pipeline, we've got our publish to QA. So what we want to do now is we want to make another step to publish to prod. So we're going to hit clone. It's going to create another stage here. And we're going to here, I'm going to change this to be publish to prod. And then we need to change this app service to be our prod app service. Okay. And again, that's the only change we need to make here. Okay. So now let's go back and look at our pipeline. So we have publish to QA and publish to prod. Now what's going to happen if I kick off a build, it's going to go and it's going to publish this to QA and then it's immediately going to publish this to prod. Exactly what we do not want to happen. So what we want to do is we want to put some constraints in here. We want to put some pre-deployment conditions. So we're going to click on this little button right here and we're going to put in a pre-deployment condition. So we want to say after stage publish to QA, then we want it to publish, but only if somebody approves. So we're going to click on pre-deployment approvals, and we're going to put in a name of somebody who has to approve this. And we'll put me since I know what I'm doing anyway. So we're going to have a pre-deployment approval, and it has to be Troy Fillerup. Now we could put multiple people in here. You may want 3 people to have to approve it before it can go to production. And if we do that, let me see if we've got, so I'm going to put Jerry Van Wee in here. So if we have 2 people in here, there's a couple of different things you can do. You can have it, the approval in any order. So I can approve it, Jerry can approve it whenever we get around to it. You can make it in sequence so that I have to approve it first and then Jerry has to approve it. Or you can have it be any one user. So that means that I can approve it or Jerry can approve it. Either way, it would work fine. I'm just going to have it stay on me for now. You can also give timeouts. You can do other things. You can do other gates. For instance, let's say you want to call out to an Azure function or invoke a REST API and make sure that that everything is lined up for this. For instance, we could maybe make a REST API that goes into prod or to POB, checks a ticket number, make sure that that ticket number is in a specific state, and if it is, then we can approve the build. So there's all kinds of things we can do with this. It's really very flexible. For this purpose, we're only going to worry about pre-deployment approvals. So what's going to happen then is that when we check something in, it'll automatically publish it to QA, but then it'll get stopped at pre-deployment wall until we go ahead and let it through. So let's save this and see if it actually does work. So we're going to come back in here and we're going to say, welcome to the new world. Oh, there you go. Welcome to the new universe. There we go. Okay. So we're going to change that. Now we're going to go in to our changes. We're going to give it a comment. Made another title change. Commit all in sync. And once that has completed, we'll come back over, we'll look at our builds to make sure it's happening. Dum, 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 dum. There's our build 7. It's in progress. It shouldn't take too long to finish. And you can see up here it gives you the comment of the last check-in that was made. So it's really easy to see in this build what happened. And in the build you can go look at the summary and it'll show you all that information as well.
Now this will be the first time it's deployed to QA.
That's right. That's exactly right. Okay, so the build finished. Let's go look at our releases. Here in a second we should get another release in here. There's our release 3. Now you'll notice that release 3 has 2 of these little squares. These other ones only had 1. This shows all of the stages in their current state. So right now it's doing the publish to QA state and it is in progress. So we can just click on that and it'll take us directly into the logs for that stage. And you can go look at the pipeline too and you can see that it's in progress here. So there it goes. This one's taking a little longer the first time because it's having to push everything up that wasn't already there, but that's okay. Okay, so we're all done. Now if we go look at our pipeline, you can see publish to QA succeeded, but it stopped on publish to prod because it's pending approval. Okay, so if we go into the web and we go to project y web dash QA, because that's what we called it, right? .azurewebsites.net, we should see our welcome to the universe. Welcome to the new universe. Our other one, our prod, is still welcome to the new world. So let's refresh that to prove it. Yeah, well, it refreshes real quick. So it's still welcome to the new world because our pipeline has not yet released to prod. So after QA is all done, we're ready to publish to prod. All we need to do is have Troy Phillip come in, click on the approve button, give a comment. Looks good to me. Thoroughly tested, and then we can approve it. So we can either, if we click approve, it's going to happen immediately. We can click reject. Let's say it doesn't look good and we want to reject this build and do another one and start over. We can reject it here, or we can defer deployment for later. Okay, it looks good, but I don't want to impact prod just yet. We'll do it at midnight tonight, so we can set it to go at midnight. I'm going to go ahead and prove it for now because I don't want to wait till midnight. So once we click that, it says it was approved. It gives us the comment, and if we come in and look at our pipeline, you can see now it's in progress. Okay, so I'm going to let that go for just a minute and really quickly touch on deployment slots. So what happens when it publishes to prod is it's going to take the prod site down while it's publishing, because it kind of has to, right? I mean, it has to replace the files, it has to do things. So it's going to take the prod site down while it's publishing. Typically you don't want it to take prod down if you can help it, because people are busy with prod. So what we have is we have this concept of deployment slots, and deployment slots do a couple of things for us. First of all, it allows us to deploy without bringing the site down. Second of all, it gives us a really easy, quick, and friction-free way to revert back to the previous version of the website. Let's say somehow a bug got introduced into prod that cripples it, but the bug wasn't in the previous version. And we want to roll back, right? In all the TCCBs that we have, there's always a what's your backout plan? What's your failback plan? Well, with deployment slots, it's really easy because you can do a swap of the deployment slots and then you're back to what you had before. So you don't have to republish anything, you don't have to re-release anything, you don't have to do a rebuild. Everything is already there, you just do a swap. So let's go see how that works. So we're going to go into our Azure portal again, and we're going to go into our Project Y web app service. So we're going to go into Project Y web. Now, in the app service, you have this deployment slots item. Now, if you're watching this after January 31st, you won't see this one. You'll only see, actually, you won't see this one. You'll only see this one because this one's replaced with this one. This one is going away at the end of January 2019. So we're going to do this one. And this is going to show all of our slots. Now, you'll notice that we have a problem. It says that we don't have any deployment slots in this particular plan because we picked the cheapest plan we could. The cheapest plan is cheap because it does not have a lot of the functionality that some of the more expensive plans do. So if we want to use deployment slots, which we do for this particular one, we need to scale up our website to a higher plan. So we're going to go find the Scale Up App Service Plan. We're going to click on that. And right now we have it free. And you'll look and see this is shared infrastructure, 1 gigabyte of memory, blah, blah, blah. This one is shared infrastructure, 1 gigabyte of memory, some compute time. This one, blah, blah. You can see everything it has here. But we're going to look at additional options. And actually, we need to go into a production load. And you can see that this one has up to 5 staging slots to use for testing and deployments. So this is the one we want. We want one with staging slots. And this also gives us the ability to auto scale, which we will touch on later. So we're going to put it on this one for now and click apply.
Changing the service plan for this web service doesn't touch QA.
It does because they're both in the same app service plan. So we would want to move these out to, we would want to separate QA into its own app service plan. We didn't do that here, but that's what we would want to do. Yeah. Okay, so now we've got this. Now we can go into deployment slots, and it will let us add deployment slots. So we've got one already. Technically, production is a slot, kind of. I mean, it's one that you just get, but we're going to add another deployment slots, and we're going to call this one deployment. Click add, and now you'll see that we have 2 deployment slots. Here in a second. Now the deployment slots are essentially just another a web app service. You deploy to them. There's a URL. You can go look at the website that's stuck in that deployment slot. It works just the same way as the app service does. So if we come in here and look at here we have our Project Y deployment. So we'll go into that deployment slot, and you can see it has all the same things that our app service had. And it also has a URL. It created a URL, projectxyweb-deployment.azurewebsites.net. So if we go to that URL, it's not going to be very exciting. See? So we don't have anything deployed in that deployment slot yet. So we want to change our release pipeline to be able to use that deployment slot. So what we're going to do is we want, once QA is approved, once the approver has gone through and said it's okay to go to prod, we want to go to the deployment slot in prod first. So we want to publish everything to the deployment slot. So we're not touching the prod instance of our site. We publish everything to the deployment slot. Once it's done, then we do what we call a swap. We'll swap the deployment slot with prod. And what that does is that takes everything that was in prod, puts it in the deployment slot, and everything that was in the deployment slot and puts it into prod. Okay? So, and the way that it does that is it's really just kind of doing IP address repointing. So it's not taking the prod site down, it's just all of a sudden you're pointed to the new stuff. Okay? And what that does is that also allows us to go back later and say, oh no, we need to swap these back because we screwed something up royal and we need to go back to what we had before. So the way that we do this is we're going to go into our stage and we're going to add another stage. So this, you can see, is releasing to the Project Y web. So that's our prod, right? What we want to do is we want to add a new step, and we want to add a swap step. So we want to change this Azure App Service Manage. We're going to add that in here. That allows us to start and stop app services, and it allows us to swap slots. So the Azure subscription that we want is the one that we've been using. And the action is swap slots. So you see with this one, we have a bunch of different actions we can take. We can start services, stop services, restart services. I mean, there's a lot of things that we can do in this. So we're going to swap slots. The app service we want to swap is the Project Y web. That's our prod. Makes us pick our resource group, which is Project Y resources. And then our source slot is going to be the deployment. And then we're going to check this swap with production. If we have multiple deployment slots, then we can have an option here to swap with a different slot. But we're just going to have this check with swap with production. So what that's going to do is it's going to take whatever's in production and swap it to deployment and vice versa. So the next thing that we need to do is we actually want to do our original deployment not to the Project Y web, but to our Project Y web deployment. So we're going to check deploy to slot and pick the options here. We're going to pick our deployment slot, and that's all we need to do. So now what's going to happen is our website is going to get deployed to the deployment slot. So all of our new stuff then is in the deployment slot. And then Azure DevOps is going to swap those slots so that the new stuff goes from the deployment slot to the production slot and vice versa. Okay. So we're going to save that. So now if you recall, in our live site now, it should say welcome to the new universe because we approved that that thing there. So welcome to the new universe. That's what we have in prod today. So we're going to come back here and we're going to say welcome to the new slot because we got a slot, right? So we're going to change it to welcome to the new slot. And again, we're just going to go through deployment slot. And we're going to commit and sync, which will kick off our entire pipeline. And let's see if things work the way we intend. So we'll go into our builds here. And we have, refresh, we have 8, which is the correct build now. It's in progress. We'll go watch it just because it's fun to do. Okay, now once that's done, let's go look at our releases. Here in a second, we should get another release. And there's our release. Let's go in and look at that. And obviously, the first thing it's going to do is publish to QA, right? Okay, so now it's published to QA. So if we go back and look at our pipeline, you can see that published to QA succeeded, and it's waiting for us to approve to prod. So let's go make sure real quick. I just like to double check. So here's our QA. So our QA should now say, welcome to the new slot, which it does. Our prod should still say, welcome to the new universe, which it does. So now if we go back to our release pipeline, I'm going to go ahead and approve this because we'll approve it. It'll kick off that release.
Will you be able to show what's in deployment after the swap?
We'll show that.
And then swap it?
So yeah, and we can swap it back inside the portal. And so we'll go do that.
See, that's good.
Okay, so we're almost done. So all of this stuff that we're doing now, we're doing it in a hosted environment. All of this stuff can be done with our local build server, builds and releases. And we could set up multiple build servers and do, parallel tasks and all kinds of stuff if we wanted to do that. So now it's succeeded. So let's go look at our live site. So this is production. It should say welcome to the new slot, which it does. But then we could go in and look at our deployment slot. So dash deployment, and it should say welcome to the new universe, which it does. Okay, so you can see that we have the old stuff now in the slot and the new stuff now in prod. So let's say something got broken, and we want the old stuff back. All we need to do is we need to go into our Azure portal, go into our web app, which is our Project Y web, go into deployment slots, and you can actually do it from the overview too. You'll notice there's a swap button up here. We're going to go into deployment slots. We're going to click swap, and then we're going to say we want to swap Project XY web with Project XY web deployment. Okay, and that will take everything back to the way that it was before. So we hit swap, we wait for it to happen.
Troy, correct me if I'm wrong, but in Project X, you actually went and created release stages. That's all it is. So.
That's right. So you can have you can create a release pipeline in Azure DevOps to swap back, and that way you can set up users in Azure DevOps that have no visibility or access to Azure Portal, and they can still do swaps if they need to do that. So we're done. So now if we come back to our web page, so here in our deployment we should have welcome to the new slot, because we went back to what it was before. And then in the production we should have welcome to the new universe, which is what we had before. So you can see we swapped them back, and that quickly we reverted back to what was in there before. So that's a wrap up for this series. We'll do another video that goes over some more stuff, but that's it for today.